The sky was red and full of smoke and fire, and Lyra could not breathe. Well, because the air was hot and dirty, and everything around her was falling apart and breaking into pieces as the ground shook like a giant monster was waking up below her. Feet and the sound of explosions was all she could hear as she ran through the ruins of what was once her home and now looked like a dead world. Held a small bag close to her chest, and inside it was a picture of her family in a tiny silver stone that her mother gave her before the war, and now her family was gone. And the only thing she had left was this stone and a memory of better days that felt like a dream. The streets were empty, but not safe because flying machines searched the ground for any movement and they fired without warning. And Lyra had already seen what they did to people who tried to escape. And she had no weapons and no power, and her only choice was to run and hide and hope the machines did not see her. She knew where she had to go because someone had told her about an old hidden base where a ship still waited deep underground, and maybe it could fly, maybe it could not, but she had to try because staying here meant death, and that was the only thing. She was sure of her boots hit broken metal and glass, but she did not stop even when her legs screamed with pain and her lungs burned with every breath, because she knew that slowing down meant being caught, and being caught meant never leaving this place, and she had to leave because her world was dying. Lyra reached the alley that led to the tunnel, and it was blocked by a wall of fire, but she remembered another way from long ago, when she played in these streets and followed the path through an old school building now full of shadows and silent desks and the smell of dust and sadness, and she moved fast like a ghost through the halls outside. She saw one of the flying machines pass overhead, and she froze behind a wall, hoping it would not turn back, and after a long moment it disappeared into the smoke, and she kept going down the alley and into a broken door that led to the underground station. The station was dark and quiet and smelled like oil and ash, and she heard water dripping somewhere in the distance, and her hands touched the cold metal rails as she moved deeper into the tunnel, her ears listening for footsteps or machines, but there was nothing except the sound of her own breath and the beat of her heart like a drum. She saw the ship before she was ready for it, a long black shape, half covered in dust and wires, and it looked dead. But she ran to it anyway and climbed up the side using a broken ladder that groaned under her weight, and she reached the hatch and pressed her hand against the scanner, and for a second nothing happened, and she thought it was over. Then the hatch clicked and opened with a hiss, and lights blinked inside, and she pulled herself into the ship and fell onto the floor, breathing hard and shaking and feeling the fear still in her bones, but also hope because the ship was real and it still worked. The inside was cold and quiet, and the lights were dim but alive, and she crawled to the pilot chair and looked at the controls that were covered in dust and cracked glass, and she touched them one by one, remembering the lessons her brother once gave her before he went away and never came back. She found the power switch and held her breath as she pushed it, and the ship shook and lights flared, and the screen in front of her showed stars and numbers and the word ready in her language, and she could not believe it. But the ship was really going to fly. She heard a sound behind her and turned to see a drone sliding into the tunnel, its eyes glowing red and its weapons charging, and she had seconds to act, and she slammed the launch button, and the ship roared to life, and the ground trembled again as the engines burned bright, and the drone fired, but the blast missed. As the ship lifted into the air, the tunnel walls blurred past her, and then the roof broke open as the ship rose higher and higher through fire and smoke and pieces of the city, and Lyra held onto the seat as the ship punched through the sky and into space where the stars were cold and silent. She looked down one last time and saw her planet breaking into pieces with fire crawling across the land like a wave, and she felt tears fall from her eyes as she whispered goodbye to a home that was no longer hers. And then she turned her face to the stars and whispered, "Please, someone here." Mesh was alone in the dark with nothing but a ship and a bag and a memory. But she was alive, and she was free, and she escaped the end now. The real journey would begin. Asterisk. The stars looked close but felt far and cold as Lyra floated in silence, surrounded by black space and empty thoughts, with only the hum of the ship to remind her that she was still alive and not just dreaming inside a metal coffin drifting between broken worlds and forgotten hopes. She had escaped fire and death and war, but now she was trapped in another kind of prison, one made of space and fear and loneliness, so deep it felt like her chest would break from the weight of it, and every second stretched like an hour with no sun and no moon and no voice to speak to. The ship moved forward slowly across the endless dark, following no path, just drifting because the navigation system was broken and the power was weak. And Lyra had no idea where she was going or if she was going anywhere at all, and she started to wonder if she escaped just to die alone in the cold. She tried to sleep, but her dreams were full of fire and screams in the faces of people she could not save, and her brother's voice calling her name again and again. Before the smoke took him away, and she always woke up with tears in her eyes and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears like a warning food was low, and water was lower, and she counted every meal in her head, even though it made her more afraid because the numbers kept getting smaller and smaller until she could not lie to herself anymore, and the truth was simple and cruel. She only had 3 days left. Maybe 4 if she stretched it. She walked through the ship each day, checking wires and switches, hoping to fix something, hoping for a miracle, but the systems blinked weakly and the engines groaned and the radio only sent static and silence back at her, like the universe itself had nothing to say, not even goodbye, one night. Or maybe it was day, since she could not tell time anymore. She sat in the control chair, holding the silver stone from her bag, and whispered her story into the radio over and over, even though she knew no one was listening, because it made her feel less invisible, and because her mother once told her that words have power even in the darker. Voice cracked and her throat was dry, but she kept talking, telling whoever might hear that her name was Lyra and her world was gone and she was not ready to die out here alone, and maybe someone was still out there, someone who cared or someone who could help, or maybe just someone who could hear her last words. She fell asleep in the chair, and when she woke up the lights were even dimmer and the ship was colder, and her hands were shaking as she reached for the last water pack and drank it slowly, pretending it would last longer if she didn't look at it too. Much the next few hours passed like fog, and she sat by the window staring at the stars and thinking about how they never changed, never burned out, never cared. They just watched everything fall apart without blinking, and she felt small, like a piece of dust floating between forgotten galaxies. She was about to shut the radio off for the last time when it happened to sound not static, not silence, but a small voice cracking through the darkness like a spark in the night, and she froze, afraid to breathe as the voice spoke again, clearer now and full of confusion and surprise. Hello, came the voice, and it was human, not her language, but human, and she had heard it before in old recordings and broken stories. And now it was real, and it was here. And she almost dropped the radio in shock, but instead she grabbed it with shaking hands and shouted, "Back, help me, please. I'm here. My ship is dying. I have no food, no power. I need help. I need help. Please, can you hear me?" There was a long pause, and she thought maybe it was a dream or a trick, or maybe the voice would vanish like smoke and leave her more alone than before. But then the reply came soft and calm and steady, like a rope thrown to someone sinking. "We hear you, Lyra. Hold on, we're coming." She didn't know who they were or how far away they were, or if they were really telling the truth. But it didn't matter, because the words reached her and wrapped around her heart and held it together when everything else was falling apart. She sat there for a long time, crying without sound and looking at the stars again. But this time they seemed warmer and less cold, and the darkness didn't feel as heavy, and she felt something she hadn't felt since the day she ran. From fire she felt hope, and in the silence between the stars, a human ship turned its path toward her, its engines lighting up the dark like a promise, and for the first time since her world. And she knew she was not alone anymore, and maybe she would live. Captain Ray was not supposed to be out this far in space, but he liked silence and long flights and the way the stars moved when no one was watching, and he always said space felt cleaner than the places he left behind on Earth, where people lied too much and laughed too little, and everything had a price, including the truth. His ship was small and old, but strong and fast, enough to dance through asteroid fields and run from pirates when needed, and he had fixed every part of it himself with hands covered in grease and memories he never talked about, not even to the stars. He was on a salvage run near the edge of a dead zone where most people never went because the signals were weak and the ghosts of broken planets still floated in pieces, and he thought maybe he could find old tech to sell, or maybe just escape from the noise of living things for a while. was when he heard her voice. It cracked through the static like a whisper through smoke, soft and shaking, but real. And alive and not a recording, not a trap, not a dream, and he sat still listening as the voice said her name was Lyra, and her ship was dying, and she had no food and no power and no one else to call. He waited because it sounded like a trap, because space was full of lies and lost things and people who would fake pain to steal your ship and your life, and he had seen it happen before in darker corners of the galaxy, but the voice came again, and this time it broke something inside him. Not because of the words, but because of how empty and scared they sounded, like someone trying to hold on to hope with hands full of ash. So he answered when Lyra heard the voice reply. She dropped the radio and covered her mouth like she was afraid to speak. Like she had imagined it and didn't want to break the dream, but then the voice said her name again and asked for her coordinates and told her to breathe slow and wait and everything would be okay. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Her body was weak, and the only word she could say clearly was please, and that was enough for Captain Ray. Punched in the numbers and turned the ship around so hard the engines groaned and the lights flickered, but he didn't stop. He didn't think twice because there was no time to waste, not when someone was that close to the end. It took 4 hours to reach her signal, and every second felt longer than the last, and Ray kept checking the radar like the stars might lie to him, and he kept hearing her voice in his head, repeating that word, please, like a string pulling him through the dark. When he saw her ship, he frowned because it looked like it should not be flying at all, full of burn marks and dents and holes, and one of the engines was completely gone, like it had been ripped off by a claw too big to be natural. He docked carefully and suited up and brought a med kit and a water pack and a small piece of chocolate, because he remembered how food could make people feel human again when the world turned cold inside. The ship was colder than ice, and the lights were dying, and the air was thin, and he moved fast through the hallway, calling her name, but no one answered, and for a moment he thought he had come too late then. He found her curled up in the control chair, eyes closed, lips blue in face, pale like frost, and without thinking he dropped to his knees and touched her wrist and felt the faint beat of a heart still trying to live. He opened the water pack and held it to her lips and whispered that she was safe now and he was real and he would not leave her here. And slowly her eyes blinked open and looked at him like he was a story. She had forgotten. Lyra did not know what to say because she had never seen a human before, only heard of them in old stories full of fear and warning. But this one was quiet, and his eyes were kind, and his hands were steady, and Warm Ray lifted her in his arms and carried her back to his ship, and every step felt like walking out of a grave and into something new, and he laid her down in a warm bed and told her to rest and that they would talk later. As the ship turned away from the wreck and moved back into open space, Lyra looked out the window, and for the first time she did not feel like running or hiding, because something in that human's voice made her believe she might have a future. And Captain Ray sat in the pilot chair watching the stars, but this time they didn't seem so cold because now he had a reason to return to the world he had left behind. And deep inside both of them, a quiet spark began to grow. Not love, not yet, but something close to it, something like trust, something like the start of hope asterisk. The stars outside were calm, but inside the ship, a storm was growing as Ray moved through the corridors, checking systems and listening for any signal that might follow them, because something about the way Lyra looked at the stars told him they were not safe yet, maybe never would. She stood by the window, arms, crossed eyes, full of thoughts, too heavy to speak, and when he asked her what happened on her planet, she did not answer at first, but then she took a slow breath and told him that running was not the end, because her enemies were not done with her. They were not machines, not like humans built for tools and work. They were alive and cruel and sharp and full of poison dreams, and when her people tried to escape, they followed them across the skies burning. Every ship that flew too slow, and silencing every voice that asked why Lyra, said they wanted her most of all, not because she was a soldier or leader or fighter, but because she had something they feared, something they wanted to crush before it could grow, because long ago her mother was part of a secret plan to stop the war from inside. A code was made not for weapons, but for healing a small light in the middle of the fire, and that code was in her, now locked in her blood and bones hidden from sight, but not from the ones who knew what to look for, and now they were coming. Ray listened without speaking, and his hands tightened on the controls as he checked the radar again, and this time he saw something fast moving behind them. Silent but sure and shaped like a shadow with teeth and claws that stretched across the stars. He told Lyra to sit and hold on because they were not just flying anymore. They were running, and the space ahead was full of rocks and storms, but better. To face chaos than the cold steel of the hunters behind them, she nodded without fear because fear was a feeling. She had already burned through, and now she only had purpose and the need to live long. Enough to make her pain mean something, and she trusted Ray not because of his strength, but because he listened. The enemy ship drew closer, not firing, not speaking, just following like a ghost hungry for what it lost, and Ray pushed his engines harder than ever before cutting between asteroids and clouds of ice, hoping they would slow the tracker down, but it kept coming like it could smell her fear in the silence between turns. Lyra whispered that the hunter was not just a ship, but something worse, something alive born in the labs of her world of creation, made to hunt minds, not just bodies. And if it got too close, it would speak to them without words and make them want to give up. Ray blinked at her words, but kept flying because there was no room for doubt and no space for fear. And when the ship shook from a near hit, he held the controls like they were the last truth in a world full of lies, and told her to trust him. The lights flickered as they passed through a gravity storm, and the walls groaned like they were tired of running, and still the hunter followed, never losing ground, never falling behind, just watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. Ray took a deep breath and flipped a hidden switch under the dash, something he had never used before because it was old and unstable, but now he had no choice, and the ship's engines roared louder than thunder as a burst of speed pushed them forward into black space. The stars turned into streaks, and Lyra gripped the chair, her eyes wide not with fear, but with wonder as she saw a piece of the galaxy most people never reached, and she felt something break loose in her chest. Not pain, but something else, like the first breath after being underwater too long, but the burst could not last, and soon. The engines cooled, and the stars returned to normal, and the ship slowed, and in that quiet moment they both waited to see if the hunter was still behind them, and when nothing showed on the radar, Ray exhaled slow, and heavy Lyra closed her eyes and leaned back, and for the first time in days she let herself rest. Just a little, because for now they had made it, and for now the past was not right behind them. Ray looked at her and saw more than a girl from another world. He saw someone who carried a future inside her, someone who needed more than a pilot, someone who needed a shield. And as he turned the ship toward the nearest safe zone, he promised himself that he would get her there no matter what, because some lights were too rare to lose, and some people were worth flying through hell for. Behind them in the deep dark, the hunter paused silent and still its red eyes, glowing in the shadows as it marked the new path, and waited for the right time to strike again, because the hunt was not over, and the past never truly let go. The stars outside were calm again, but inside, Lyra's heart was heavy with secrets too big to carry alone, and Ray could see it in the way she moved in the way. Her eyes searched every screen like she expected something to go wrong, like safety. It was only a short breath before the next fire. They had found a quiet place behind the shadow of a moon, cold and dark and hidden from the hunter that still searched the stars, and Ray used the time to repair the engine while Lyra sat near the main console holding the silver stone her mother gave her before the world fell apart. She had not told him everything. Not yet, because some truths were dangerous even to speak. And she was afraid of what he might do if he knew the real reason she was hunted, if he knew what she carried in her blood and why her people died trying to protect it. But Ray was patient and kind, and when he brought her warm soup and sat beside her without asking questions, she looked at him and saw someone who had also lost things, someone who understood pain without words, and maybe that was enough, so she began to speak. She said her people were once full of light and knowledge, and they had ships and medicine and peace. But the peace did not last, because power always finds a crack to slip through, and one day a voice came from deep space, promising more, promising safety, promising a future without fear. That voice became a leader, and the leader became a ruler, and the ruler used fear to break unity and turn cities Into prisons and science, into chains, and soon the people forgot what peace even looked like. But some remembered Lyra. Best mother was one of them, a scientist who believed that the body could carry more than blood and bones, that it could hold healing. That could grow like seeds across galaxies and bring life back to broken worlds. Not through machines, but through people, through something living and real. They made a code something so rare and pure that even machines could not copy it, a code that could heal poisoned planets and dying air and even sickness in the bones of a world, and they hid it where no scanner could find it inside a child. Who was never supposed to be born into war, that child was Lyra. She was just 10 when her mother told her the truth, and by then it was already too late. The ruler had found them and burned their labs and silenced their names, but not before her mother took Lyra and ran across the stars, always hiding, always afraid, until they were caught, and only Lyra escaped Ray, listened without moving, and when she finished, he did not ask for proof. He did not ask if it was safe. He only asked one thing: what would happen if the enemy got her? And Lyra looked him in the eyes and said they would not use the code to heal, they would twist it to kill. Ray stood and walked to the window and stared into the black sky, thinking about Earth and all the broken places still healing from wars and storms and hunger. And then he turned to her and said, "We're going." They were taking the code to Earth. Lyra shook her head because Earth would never accept her, not now, not after what happened with the last contact, not after the galaxy turned cold and closed and blamed aliens for their pain. She said they would lock her away, or worse, they would take the code and destroy her with it. But Ray said, Earth has changed, or at least some people have, and maybe not all, but maybe enough to matter, and sometimes you don't need everyone, just the right one, just one. Hand reaching back when yours is slipping, they argued quietly for an hour, both afraid of the cost, both carrying more than they could show. But in the end, Lyra said yes, because she was tired of hiding and tired of running, and because Ray said would not let them hurt her. The ship left the shadow of the moon and turned toward Earth, and Lyra stood beside the pilot chair watching as the stars moved slowly past, and she reached for the silver stone again and held it close, not because it had power, but because it reminded her of the reason she had to keep going. But deep inside the ship, something else moved, a small flicker in the scanner, a shadow that did not belong there. And Ray narrowed his eyes and checked the screen again and saw a faint signal hidden under noise, like a whisper in a storm, and it was following them. The hunter had found their trail. Lyra saw the screen, and her heart dropped, but Ray only said, "Hold on," because the race was not over, and now the finish line was Earth, and what waited there would either save them or end everything. They flew faster than before through dust clouds and broken satellites, and the silence between them was full of fear and hope and fire and something new that neither of them could name, but both could feel. And the heart of that silence, Lyra closed her eyes and whispered to herself that maybe, just maybe, this time she would not run alone. Asterisk. The blue of Earth filled the window, and it looked soft and peaceful from a distance, like a dream Lyra once had about quiet fields and clean water and skies without fire. But she knew better, because peace was only real if people chose it, and she had seen too many choose fear. Instead, Ray sent a signal to the orbital station with his ID code and a simple message that said he had a guest who needed help. And the answer came back fast and cold with no welcome. No warmth, just coordinates and a warning not to change course or power down would be forced. He looked at Lyra and said they would be okay, but his voice was tight and his eyes did not match his words. And Lyra sat still in the back room of the ship, holding her stone and telling herself that Earth was different now, that someone here would listen, that someone here would see her as more than a threat. But when they landed, soldiers surrounded the ship with guns raised and helmets sealed, and not one of them spoke to her. They spoke only to Ray, and they told him to stand down and step aside, and he tried to explain that she was not dangerous, that she was the only hope for dying worlds, but they did not care. They took Lyra and placed her in a cold metal room with no windows and no voices, only a camera and a speaker that asked her the same questions. Again and again, where did you come from? What do you carry? Why did you come to Earth? Who else knows about you? What is your purpose? She answered the first time and the second time and the third time, but by the 10th she only stared, because she could see it now in the way they looked at her through the glass. They did not want to understand, they only wanted control. Ray Was not allowed to see her, not at first, and when he demanded answers, they gave him lies and reports full of fear and danger, and risk and words like unknown threat and classified anomaly. And he slammed his hand on the wall and said, she was a person, not a weapon. He found a way to sneak into the lower level of the facility using a trick he learned during his time in the military before he walked away from orders and uniforms and the sound of people being told who to be and who to fear. And he found her room and looked through the small glass square and saw her sitting on the floor, not crying, not shaking, just still like a candle waiting for wind. He tapped the glass in her eyes. Rose, slow and tired, and when she saw him, she did not smile, but her hand moved just slightly as if to say, I knew you'd come. He did not break the door, not yet, but he promised her through the wall that he would find someone who mattered, someone with the power to listen, someone who could see past the rules and the shadows, and he meant it, but time was running out because in the sky above Earth something else had come. Something big and quiet and sharp and full of red light that flickered in the dark like a warning, and every scanner on Earth saw it, and the same word appeared on every screen. Unknown craft, approaching threat level, rising unknown intent, prepare. Defenses. The hunter had arrived, and the control center voices rose, and alarms screamed, and orders flew like bullets, and still no one listened to Ray when he said they were not ready, that guns would not work, that the hunter was not here to fight with lasers or bombs, but with fear and silence and whispers in the mind. Lyra felt it before the sirens even started to pull in her chest. Like the air had turned heavy and the light had grown thin, and she stood and walked to the wall and whispered to herself that she had come here to help, not to hide, not to wait for others to decide what her life was worth. Ray found the highest officer he could and shouted until the man listened. And when he showed them the data, the scans, the code, the truth, they hesitated because the facts were clear and the risk was greater than before. And now they had two choices: open the door and let her try, or watch the sky burn. Order came slow and shaky. Opened the door, walked out into the light of Earth. For the first time, not with fear, not with anger, but with a calm that came from knowing who she was and why she came, and the soldiers stepped aside, not because they trusted her, but because they had nothing else. Left Ray, stood beside her, and took her hand, and for a second nothing moved and the air was quiet, and then the hunter came close enough to be seen a shadow that blotted out the stars and spoke. Without speaking into the minds of every person on the ground, Lyra closed her eyes and let the code awaken inside her, a wave of soft green light that flowed from her skin into the sky. Not loud, not violent, just true. And the hunter paused, as if confused, as if it had forgotten what pain felt like, and the red light began to fade in. In that moment, Earth saw her not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as hope wrapped in flesh and choice. And Ray smiled, not because the danger was gone, but because they had chosen to believe. For the first time, the door to tomorrow was open. The green light still moved across the sky like soft waves in a quiet sea, touching clouds and towers and mountaintops. And even deep oceans, and every place it touched began to feel different, like the world was taking a deep breath for the first time in a long time, and Earth itself was listening. Lyra stood in the center of it, all her hands raised, her eyes closed, her feet planted on soil that had never known her, but somehow felt like home in the code. Inside her was no longer quiet now. Longer hidden, it moved through her like a river and flowed out into the world without fear, without anger, without pain. People watched from cities and fields and broken places with cracked windows and empty roads, and they did not understand what they were seeing, but they knew something important was happening, something that would not come again and could not be ignored. Ree stood beside her, not moving, not speaking, just watching as the girl he saved became something larger than he ever expected. Not a weapon, not a mystery, not a lost alien from a broken world, but a light that even darkness hesitated to touch. In the skies above, the hunter ship hovered still and silent, no longer red, no longer hunting, as if it too was listening to the same quiet music that poured out of Lyra's being. And for the first time since it was born, it felt something it could not explain, something it had no order for. Deep inside the Earth command centers and military halls, leaders and scientists gathered around screens, showing the data rising and the numbers clearing and the air becoming lighter and the atmosphere healing itself, like scars fading from a tired body and Some wept without knowing why Lyra began to fall, her body shaking. Her breath uneven, and Ray caught her before she hit the ground and held her close and told her. She did more than anyone ever could, that she gave them all a second chance. And now it was their turn to protect her, but not everyone agreed far away. In a cold room behind locked doors, a man in a black suit spoke to a group with worried eyes and sharp questions and said they could not allow something so powerful to walk free that even if it helped, it could still be a threat tomorrow or 10 years from now. And the others listened because fear was easier than faith. They sent a message to the unit near the field where Ray and Lyra stood, and the order was clear: take her into custody for study, for safety, for control. And no one asked what she wanted because her choice did not fit the plan. Ray saw the ships coming before the message even reached the ground, and he knew what it meant because he had seen it before when power saw hope and called it danger. And he looked at Lyra, who was awake now but weak and pale, and he said, we have to go. They ran not because they were guilty, not because they were wrong, but because they knew what would happen. If they stayed because systems fear what they cannot control and love is harder. To explain on a threat level, a door opened in the ground, a hidden hatch. Ray had installed long ago when he still believed he would need to run again someday, and they slipped inside just before the soldiers landed and disappeared into the tunnels. Below the city, the chase began again, but this time it was not just about escape. It was about showing the world that something good was not always dangerous, that sometimes the right thing was small and quiet and full of light and did not wear a flag or speak in orders. People began to speak out as the news spread. People who had felt the change, people whose air no longer burned, whose children no longer coughed, whose fields grew where dust once lay, and they asked, why is she being hunted? Why are you chasing hope? The question grew louder each hour, and soon even the ones who gave the orders had to answer it, and their words were not strong enough, not honest enough, not human enough, and the crowd began to rise like a wave. Lyra and Ray reached a quiet place in the mountains, far from cities and noise. And they sat together watching the stars, and he asked her what she wanted to do now, and she smiled weakly and said, live, just live, and maybe help others do the same. She held his hand, and he held hers, and neither spoke because some moments are too full for words, and both of them knew. They had already changed the future in a way no law or bullet could stop. The hunter ship above, Earth still watched but did not move. And inside its core, the red had gone out and something new had started to grow. Not orders, not commands, but a choice, and maybe even something like feeling. Lyra's message had spread not just to Earth, but into space, and other worlds had heard. And other voices had started to ask, what if the ones we fear are the ones who can heal? What if the monsters are not real? What if the stories are wrong? And so began a new chapter, not written in war or silence, but in questions and in hands reaching. Across stars, not to take, but to share, not to rule, but to understand. And the first hand was hers, and the first to take it was human. And in that one moment, across two worlds, something finally changed forever.